Let's open the bidding at $5,000. Do I hear five? I got five, now six, looking for 6,000.
Nobody knew where he came from, a ragged stranger, quiet and unassuming. But when the legendary stallion went up for auction, everything changed. What happened next left the entire crowd gasping in disbelief. The auction hall was alive with noise and movement. People leaned over railings and whispered behind fans, eyes fixed on the center stage where the legendary stallion stood. Its coat gleamed under the soft lights, each muscle taut and powerful. The horse shifted its weight, nostrils flaring, as if sensing the excitement around it. Whispers spread across the crowd, some admiring its beauty, others calculating how much they would spend to claim it. Among the crowd, a stranger stepped quietly through the throng. His clothes were worn, dust clinging to the edges of his boots. He carried no bag, no papers, nothing to mark him as a bidder. Most did not even notice him at first. He moved with a steady calm, watching every detail. His eyes never left the stallion, studying its stance and its energy. The auctioneer cleared his throat and raised his gavel. The chatter subsided to an expectant silence. The first bid was called and the room erupted with competitive energy. Hands shot up, voices clashed, and numbers climbed faster than anyone could follow. The stranger remained still, almost invisible, absorbing the scene as though it belonged to someone else. Yet there was something about him that drew attention in small ways. A nod here, a quiet sigh there, as if he already knew the horse in ways the crowd could not imagine. Those who glanced at him felt a shiver of curiosity, though they could not explain why. No one could guess that he would soon change the entire course of the auction, leaving every person in that hall stunned and speechless. The stranger had walked many roads, but few knew his story. He carried no identification, no letters, no proof of who he was. Only the dust on his boots and the faint smell of hay hinted at a life spent in barns and open fields. People in the auction hall might have seen him as nothing more than a curious observer, a wanderer drawn to spectacle. But every step he took, every quiet glance at the legendary stallion, was guided by memory and purpose. Years ago, he had been a boy with a small farm at the edge of a distant town. Horses had been his companions, his teachers, and his friends. He had learned early that these animals had a language all their own, spoken through a shift of weight, a flick of the ear, a glance in the eye. Among all the horses he had known, there was one that had changed everything, a young stallion with fire in his step and intelligence in his gaze. That horse had saved him more than once, whether from harsh winters, lonely nights, or moments when despair crept too close. Circumstances had forced him to leave that life behind. His family lost the farm, and he drifted from town to town, learning odd trades, working in stables, and following the faint trail of horses he had loved. He had heard whispers of the legendary stallion, of its unmatched speed and rare bloodline. Rumors placed it in auctions far from the fields of his youth, and every time he heard the name, a knot tightened in his chest. He did not seek wealth or recognition. His desire was simple but urgent, to see the horse again, to be near it, to protect it from those who would see it as a prize rather than a living creature. The stranger's life had been one of solitude, shaped by hardship and quiet lessons in patience and observation. Yet beneath the ragged clothing and the worn boots, there was resolve, and a determination that would soon alter the course of the auction. When he stepped into the hall that day, he carried more than hope. He carried the memory of every early morning with the horses of his youth, every moment he had promised to honor them, and the silent vow that he would never let a creature he cared for be treated as a commodity. The auctioneer's voice cut through the hall, crisp and commanding. "Do I hear 10,000? 10,000. Now 15-inch bids climbed rapidly, voices overlapping. Hands shot up, nods and gestures flew through the air, and the room pulsed with a mix of tension and excitement. Every eye was on the stallion, every mind racing with calculation. Wealthy buyers leaned forward, measuring each other, testing the limits of who would pay the most. The stranger stood back, watching. He did not speak, did not raise his hand, but his gaze followed every move. He noticed the small habits of the buyers, the confident gestures, the nervous twitches, the quick glances to see who would fold next. He saw the stallion's subtle shifts, the flick of an ear, the clench of a jaw. The horse was alive with awareness, reacting to every rise and fall of the bids, and the stranger felt a pulse of recognition deep in his chest. A sudden cheer rose from the crowd as one of the wealthiest bidders called an outrageous number. Murmurs spread, admiration mixed with disbelief. The auctioneer's gavel hovered over the podium, waiting, eyes sweeping the room. Bids continued to climb, each one higher than the last, the tension thick enough to feel in the chest. The stranger remained quiet, unmoved, a calm presence amid the storm of voices and gestures. Yet inside, his heart was steady but alert. He knew the stallion. He knew the power and intelligence in every muscle. He understood what it would take to win, and he measured the scene with patience rather than haste. As the bidding reached staggering numbers, a few spectators began to notice the stranger. Who was this ragged man standing silently at the back? There was no sign of wealth or influence, no hint that he could possibly compete with the high rollers. A whisper passed through the room. "Do you see him? Can he even afford to bid?" He did not answer. He simply observed, waiting for the precise moment when patience would turn into action. The crowd was unaware that the calm figure in the corner held something more powerful than money or status. He held knowledge, experience, and an unshakable resolve. When he finally made his move, it would shock everyone and leave the auction hall forever changed. The room was electric with tension. Bids had soared higher than anyone could have imagined. Numbers shouted over each other, voices straining with excitement and disbelief. The legendary stallion shifted in its stall, muscles coiled, nostrils flaring, eyes wide with awareness. Every person in the auction hall was fixated, calculating, strategizing, trying to outbid the others. Then, without warning, the stranger stepped forward. The floorboards creaked beneath his worn boots, drawing a few curious glances. He raised his hand slowly, deliberately. A murmur ran through the crowd. Who was he? The ragged man at the back of the hall, quiet and almost invisible until now. The auctioneer paused, eyebrows raised, scanning the crowd for recognition. The stranger's voice broke the tension. "Clear, calm, and steady," he said. "I bid 50,000. A gasp swept through the room. 50,000. In an instant, the confident smiles of seasoned bidders faltered. Whispers erupted like wildfire. "Who is he? Can he even afford that? Is he serious?" The auctioneer faltered, uncertain, before nodding. 50,000. Do I hear 55? The stranger remained still, his gaze locked on the stallion. The horse's ears pricked, as if sensing the change in the air. There was a connection, invisible to everyone else, but unmistakable to him. The bidders hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. No one expected a figure like this to step into their world of wealth and competition and challenge them so directly. Bids climbed again, but every counteroffer met the stranger's unwavering resolve. 55,000. 60. 65. Each number drew shocked stares, some incredulous, some admiring, but none could guess the determination that fueled him. He did not flinch. He did not waver. He simply raised his hand when the time came, and the room held its breath. Then, finally, the auctioneer slammed the gavel down. Silence fell instantly. The legendary stallion's new owner had been chosen. The crowd's disbelief was palpable. Some stared openly, mouths slightly agape, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Others muttered under their breath, trying to rationalize it. The stranger, however, turned toward the stallion, offering nothing but a quiet, almost reverent acknowledgement. The horse stepped toward him, muscles rippling, nostrils flaring, eyes locking with the stranger's. In that moment, the hall faded from their minds. There was no wealth, no competition, no murmurs of the crowd. There was only understanding, trust, and a bond that transcended the chaos around them. For the first time, the stranger felt a deep sense of relief, tempered with awe. He had come to claim something more than a prize. He had come to honor a connection, to protect a creature he understood in ways that no one else could. And in the stunned silence of the auction hall, the truth was clear. Nobody there would ever forget the day the ragged stranger snatched the legendary stallion, leaving them speechless. The hall fell into stunned silence. The gavel had struck, and the legendary stallion's new owner was revealed. The stranger stood calmly, almost unnoticed amid the gasps and whispered questions, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Eyes that had been fixed on numbers and strategy now turned to him, trying to understand who this man was and how he had done what no one else could. Whispers rippled like a current through the crowd. "Who is he?" someone asked. "Where did he come from?" Another voice muttered, "He doesn't even look like he belongs here." A few seasoned buyers shook their heads in disbelief, clutching their papers and imagining how their plans had been completely upended. Pride and frustration danced across faces that had never expected to be outbid by a man in dust-stained boots and a weathered coat. The auctioneer cleared his throat, attempting to regain control, but his words barely registered. The crowd's attention was fully captured by the stranger and the horse. The stallion, sensing something in the air, lowered its head slightly and stepped toward its new owner. Every muscle in the horse's body was alert, yet there was a strange calm in the way it approached him. Some in the audience exchanged startled glances, realizing that the connection between man and horse was more than chance. Phones were raised, cameras clicked, and a few people even whispered to the auctioneer to stop the bidding entirely, unable to believe what had happened. People debated in hushed tones, some angry, some in awe. How could someone so unknown, so unassuming, triumph in a room filled with influence and wealth? Amid the chaos, the stranger did not look at the crowd. He simply extended his hand, allowing the stallion to step closer, a gentle recognition passing between them. For the first time that day, the auction hall's clamor faded into insignificance. The shock was not just in the crowd's disbelief, but in the realization that the rules they had relied on, status, money, reputation, had been set aside by something far older and more profound: trust, understanding, and quiet determination. By the time people began to whisper their astonishment to each other, the stranger and the stallion were already moving toward the exit. The room was left with a lingering tension, awe, and a story that would be told for years. Nobody could forget the day the ragged stranger rewrote the rules of the auction. Once the crowd's murmurs faded behind him, the stranger led the stallion away from the chaos of the auction house. The two moved with an unspoken rhythm, each step careful and deliberate. Nobody in that hall could have guessed the reason he had gone to such lengths. The connection he shared with this horse ran far deeper than admiration or ambition. Years ago, when the stranger was still a boy, he had stumbled upon a foal abandoned in the snow near his family's farm. Weak, trembling, and nearly lifeless, the foal had clung to him instinctively. From the very first moment, a bond had formed, quiet, unspoken, and unbreakable. That foal had grown into a magnificent horse, strong and spirited, with intelligence and awareness that few could comprehend. The stranger had nurtured it through storms, cold winters, and long lonely nights, learning the language of its subtle movements, the stories told through its gaze and stance. Life had not been kind. Circumstances beyond his control had forced him away, and the horse had been sold. Time and distance could not erase the memory, nor the promise he had whispered on that snowy morning, that if ever fate allowed, he would protect the horse again. Hearing of the legendary stallion at auction had awakened that memory and that promise. It was not wealth that drove him to the hall. It was loyalty, compassion, and the quiet determination to honor the bond he had forged long ago. Every bid he made, every glance he cast, was measured, patient, and deliberate. The stallion had recognized him immediately, sensing a familiar presence, a trust that no stranger could command. As they walked toward a quiet stable waiting outside the city, the stranger reached out, running his hand along the stallion's neck. The horse nudged him gently, leaning into the touch. The bond was evident, unmistakable. He had come not to claim a prize, but to reclaim what had always been theirs. What had once been lost was now restored, not through force, but through patience, understanding, and the quiet courage to act when the moment arrived. In that shared silence, there was a sense of triumph, but it was different from any applause or recognition the auction could offer. It was a triumph of trust, memory, and the extraordinary connection between a man and the horse he had once saved and would never let go again. The auction hall slowly emptied, but the echoes of disbelief lingered long after the last footstep faded. Conversations buzzed in low tones, each person trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Some shook their heads, muttering about luck or audacity. Others whispered about the stranger's courage, unable to deny the quiet power in his actions. The story of the ragged man who had claimed the legendary stallion spread instantly through the crowd, and soon the news began to seep beyond the walls of the auction house. Trainers, buyers, and journalists all scrambled to piece together the mystery. Who was he? How had someone so unknown outbid some of the wealthiest figures in the horse world? People shared photographs and videos, capturing the brief moment when the stranger's hand had lifted and the gavel had struck. Social media lit up with speculation. Some called him reckless. Others called him heroic. And through it all, nobody could ignore the undeniable bond between him and the horse. Even the seasoned bidders, those accustomed to strategy and power, found themselves humbled. They had relied on money, reputation, and skill, but in the end, none of it mattered against a man guided by patience, knowledge, and instinct. The stallion had chosen, in its own way, and the stranger had recognized the signs that everyone else had overlooked. Meanwhile, outside the city, the stranger led the horse to a small, quiet stable. The air was filled with the scent of hay and earth, far from the tension of the auction hall. Here, he could finally breathe, and the stallion could stretch its legs without the weight of spectators and bids pressing down. Together, they walked in silence, each step a reassurance that what had been won was more than property. It was trust, respect, and a promise kept. The world would continue to talk, and the auction would be remembered as the day a ragged stranger defied expectations and stunned the elite. Yet for him, the crowd's reaction mattered little. What mattered was the quiet understanding between man and horse, the knowledge that he had honored a connection that neither money nor status could ever replicate. And as the city faded behind them, the stranger finally felt a calm certainty. The horse was safe, the promise was kept, and nothing could ever take that away. The stable was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon light. The stranger led the stallion into the open paddock, letting him step freely onto the fresh grass. The horse paused for a moment, nostrils flaring, then broke into a smooth, powerful trot, muscles rippling under the sun. The stranger watched, a faint smile touching his face, feeling the bond they had long nurtured finally restored. He reached out, running his hand along the stallion's neck, and the horse leaned into the touch without hesitation. There was no need for words, none had ever been necessary. Years of trust, care, and understanding flowed between them in that quiet exchange. Every struggle, every hardship, every lonely mile traveled in search of this moment had led to now. For the stranger, it was more than a victory at an auction. It was a reclaiming of something essential, a reminder that connection and patience could triumph over wealth and expectation. The stallion, now free from the pressures of the auction hall, seemed to sense the calm, moving in graceful circles as if celebrating their reunion. As dusk settled, the stranger led the horse to a small barn, placing fresh hay and water before him. He stood back, watching as the stallion settled comfortably, trusting that he would be safe here. Outside, the world continued on, unaware of the quiet triumph that had just unfolded. In that moment, the stranger felt something he had not known in years: peace. A chapter had closed, but a new one had begun, a life filled with care, freedom, and the enduring bond between a man and the horse he had once saved. Whatever stories were told of the auction, whatever fame or curiosity might follow, it could never match the quiet certainty that they were finally home.